particularly the history of our people, our town, taking that information and putting it all together to share with you in a historic view in his presentation of Dixon's remarkable role in the Civil War. So I'd like to introduce to you now Tom Wadsworth.
All right, thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and it's great to see a good crowd here tonight to hear about the Civil War. Just to let you know where I'm coming from on this thing, I knew nothing about Dixon in the Civil War for a long time until a few years ago I decided to start investigating it. Why would I do that? Well, I had learned many years ago that I had an uncle from Dixon who was in the Civil War, who was killed in the Civil War, and I kind of wanted to know more. And as it turns out, tracing his history is much like tracing the history of Dixon in the Civil War. So I'm going to tell you I'll tell you a little bit about him, but mostly about Dixon and its remarkable role in the Civil War. I'm going to be up here for most of tonight because I need to see my notes here on my laptop. So you'll see everything up here on the screen, hopefully as well as we can. Dixon's remarkable role in the Civil War actually begins 30 years before the Civil War begins. There were several Civil War standouts who came to Dixon in 1832. And so who am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about, you remember Fort Dixon, of course. This is a photo of Fort Dixon. This hangs now at the Loveland Community Building up there on the top floor, the museum floor. And this painting was done by, I've already forgotten his name, but Noah Brooks made this painting with consulting from John Dixon, Father John Dixon, and several other individuals who were there to witness Fort Dixon before it was torn down in 1845. And so this painting is extremely close to the way it looked in 1832. That's the Rock River here in, let me see here. There we go. This is the Rock River down here, and there's the ferry just getting off on the north side of the river. Over there, you know, where the log cabin sits today, that's roughly where this Fort Dixon stood in 1832. Now, who are the Civil War standouts? Well, there are several of them. And here is a photo of 6 of the standouts from the Civil War. We're talking about Abraham Lincoln, of course, down in the lower center area. Abraham Lincoln was here in Dixon. As you know, we've got that statue over there at the Lincoln statue along Lincoln Statue Drive here in Dixon. Why is it there? Well, because he was here in 1832. He was a Civil War standout. To the left of him is Jefferson Davis. Yes, the president of the Confederate States of America was here in Dixon for probably a longer period of time than Abraham Lincoln was. Jeff Davis and John Dixon got to be relatively good friends because Jefferson Davis was here actually before the Civil War and in preparation for it getting going, and he had a lot to do with Fort Dixon itself. But there's also on the lower right-hand corner General Robert Anderson, who became a general in the Civil War. You may not recognize that name, but you should. He was the guy, Major Robert Anderson, who was in charge of Fort Sumter when the Civil War first broke out in April of 1861. He became quite famous after defending Fort Sumter from the Confederates at that time. Upper left-hand corner is General Joseph E. Johnston. He was a Confederate general who was here in Dixon as a lieutenant in the Army. At the top center is General Winfield Scott, who was a general at that time, and he remained the general of the U.S. Army, the big general of all the Army for years and years until he retired at the beginning of the Civil War. And on the upper right-hand corner is General Albert Sidney Johnston, another Confederate general who is here in Dixon at Fort Dixon in 1832. I don't know about you, but I think that alone is pretty fascinating to have all these famous generals and 2 presidents. Actually, there's a 3rd president, too, which I'll talk about here in a minute. There is this painting that hangs now at the Northwest Illinois Territory, Northwest Territory Center at Old South Central School. Franz Swarbrick made this painting in 1995. It's just her own depiction of what must have been going on at Fort Dixon. This is a Fort Dixon image. You can see the buildings in the back look much like that painting from Noah Brooks I just showed you. But if you zoom in closer to this painting on the left, that guy slumped over his horse, raising his hand and getting sworn in, mustered into the Army. You know who that is, of course. That's Abraham Lincoln. Over there on the other side of this painting are these two guys who he's being sworn in by, and one is Lieutenant Jefferson Davis. Now get this, Lieutenant Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, swearing in President Abraham Lincoln, the President of the Union. This happening right here in Dixon. Now, there's some question as to whether it was Jeff Davis who actually did the swearing in to Lincoln or not. But regardless, they were both here in Dixon 30 years before the Civil War breaks out. I don't know about you, that blows my mind. The other guy in this photo is Lieutenant Colonel Zachary Taylor, who later became President of the United States. And what was it, if I got my details right, in 1850 over the 4th of July, he ate a big bowl of cherries and poured it down with some cold milk, and he died 3 days later. So I don't know if there's a lesson in there somewhere. I have no idea what it is, though. Cherries are still pretty good. So, but let's get on to the Civil War. 1861, this is when Civil War breaks out. Now, this is, 63 years ago when the Civil War first broke out in April. They fired on Fort Sumter, as I mentioned earlier, in April 12th and 13th of April and 61. Now, the news of this spread throughout the country by newspaper at the time, and Dixon had a newspaper in 1861, the Dixon Telegraph, of course, which started up in 1851. So the Telegraph is 10 years old by this time, and people are reading all about the rebellion going on and the firing on our Fort Sumter in Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and everybody's getting fired up about this. One of the quotes in the Lee County history is this: Lee County only needed the shot fired upon Fort Sumter that April day to fan to a flame the smoldering fire of patriotism. Everyone, from the old people to the children, could think or talk of little else. That was from Frank Stevens' 1914 History of Lee County. And so many of the historians throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, they knew a ton about what happened in the Civil War. There was a great fascination about all the battles, all the soldiers, and there's no lack of research that has been done on what's been going on back then. So when you read about people or places or things in the Civil War, there's a very good chance it's all accurate stuff because it was well chronicled and taken care of historically. If you want to know what Dixon looked like at this time, this is a photo of Dixon in the 1860s. You can kind of tell where this photo was taken as we all go down that same hill every day from the top of the Lee County, Galena Avenue, going down, looking toward the river. That bridge right there is the Lucky Bridge, which wasn't so lucky because it collapsed like all the bridges did back in the 1850s and 60s, up until the Truesdell Bridge in 1873, which also collapsed tragically, killing 46 Dixonites. But this was what downtown Dixon looked like. If you look closely at this thing, you can see that it's a dirt road. It's not paved, right down Galena Avenue, dirt road. There's no electricity, no electrical wires up here or poles. There's no cars, of course. Everybody's riding a horse. Who's going to get anywhere is be on a horse or in a wagon at that time. The sidewalks were all made out of wood. It's just the way Dixon was in the 1860s when the Civil War is going on. This is a map that I got from the Lee County Historical Society, just a block down the street here. You got to see this map, by the way. It hangs on the wall there. It's just fascinating. It's from 1868, which also helps us see roughly what Dixon was like during the Civil War years, which is 61 to 65. And they all, when the soldiers wanted to enlist for the war, they went to the Lee County Courthouse, and that's where you see that guy's head right there, and that's where the Lee County Courthouse, of course, stood then. Is where it still stands to this day. This would be the Glean Avenue Bridge down here. This is the dam here. The island is up that way, but otherwise, this is the south side of Dixon, where we are sitting right now. But that is where everybody went when they wanted to sign me up for the war, let me go kill me some Rebs. That's what they did. I found this depiction of, notice down here at the bottom, it says where Company A of the 13th Illinois Regiment was recruited. And that's at the Lee County Courthouse. Now, the courthouse doesn't look like this anymore because it was replaced in 1900, but it still stood on the exact same place where today's courthouse stood. There were three, not one, not two, but three training camps in Dixon. And by using this map, looking mostly at the south side here, I'll show you where they were. Training camp number 1 is out here. They called it Camp Dixon. It was west. Where am I standing? You know, the viaducts are out this way. It's on the other side of the viaducts, out on the west end, where there was no houses back then in 1861, down along the river. That's where Camp Dixon was. Also up there at Mentown, over that away, they also had some barracks. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But there was a third place where the soldiers did train in Dixon, and that's out at Oakwood Cemetery. Not on the cemetery itself, but just east of Oakwood Cemetery, and that's where you see that. That sign I just showed you shows the street sign that's out at Oakwood Cemetery to this day, and the name of the main street going back into Oakwood Cemetery is called Old Campground Avenue. Next time you're out at the cemetery, look at the street signs, which nobody does, but you'll see Old Campground Avenue, and that's referring to the campground for the Civil War. I wondered for a long time as to where exactly was the campground, and I found a clue in an obituary for a guy named Captain William Wood. I think I've got his first name right. When he died, many years later, he said that he wanted to be buried overlooking the campground where he trained at beloved Dixon, Illinois, for the Civil War. And sure enough, his grave is right there, right by Campground Avenue, overlooking the east side of Oakwood Cemetery. Now, you got to understand, in 1861, there's just a handful of graves out there. It's not spread all over the place like it is today. Most of the graves would be up toward the front. You know, Father John Dixon's monument is there at the front, and all the old ones are up there. But toward the back of the cemetery, that was all just grass and hills, and there was nobody there. But that's where they trained for the Civil War back in 1861. This is a rare photo, also hanging at the Loveland Building, of Camp Dement in 1861. Somebody took a photo of the Illinois 13th Infantry Regiment just when they were training before they went off to war, and that's Company B of the Illinois 13th, taken in Dixon, Illinois. And that photo is a big photo, this big, hangs up at the Loveland Building right now. If you go up to the Loveland Building, you can see this amazing photo. And down below there, you see all these names of these people. This is the names of the soldiers who were in Company B of the Illinois 13th. You need to remember the Illinois 13th, that number, because that becomes significant throughout our presentation here tonight. It was the proud Illinois 13th. They were very proud of what they did during the war. This is a closer view of that same image of Company B. By the way, Company B primarily had mostly Sterling soldiers in it. It was Company A that had Dixon soldiers in it, of course. But now a company, and you guys are in the Army, it will embarrass me here with my lack of knowledge, but back then a company had 100 men. 100, or roughly right around that. And it took 10 companies to make up a regiment. And so a regiment then had 1,000 soldiers in it. So 10 companies, Company A, B, C, D, and all right on up to the 10th one, and then they would all make up the 13th Illinois Regiment. And that's what these guys were. You notice none of them are carrying weapons. When they're training in Dixon, there's no, I don't have no record that they were shooting, target practice. They're just marching. let's figure this out, guys. You march this way, I'll march that way. I don't know what else they're learning. There's not a whole lot of strategy to what they're doing in the Civil War, but there they are. They're learning how to stand up straight and stand in a line and not left, and all that. But that's what they're finally learning. They did not stay in Dixon very long before they were just sent off to war to go fight the rebels. One statement I found about Camp Dement in 1861 from the Lee County History in 1914. Colonel John Dement. By the way, Colonel John Dement, look up here in this stained glass window here. It's in memoriam, John Dement and his wife. I can't see her, Mary or something? But there you go. Colonel John Dement was a member here at the Methodist Church, and he was very well known in Dixon. Dement Avenue, not only North Dement, but South Dement as well. We also have Dement Town over there. So he's a well-known guy, and he was famous in the Black Hawk War of 1832, and by the time of the Civil War, 30 years later, he is highly recognized in Dixon, well-regarded, and he heads up the camp, Camp Dixon. It says Colonel John Dement was named the commander of the camp. His encampment set up winter quarters in a stone building that had been a plow factory near the depots up there, the Dement Town. This is his area. I wondered about this reference to this stone building. Well, I got to looking through the records at the Lee County Historical Society, and they've got a folder that's got this picture of the stone building. Actually, it's a drawing of the barracks called Dixon Barracks in 1862. It shows it's got a top view and a side view, and it stood up there where a lot of the factories are up to that have been up there over the years, for years and years, up in Dement Town, up by the railroad depot. If you look again at that map of 1868, that's where Camp Dement was, up there at Dement Town in Dixon, Illinois. Now, this becomes very important that they're up there at the depot station, because the railroad became very significant for prosecuting the war. And Dixon was at a unique spot back then, being at the intersection of two significant railroads, which I'll mention here in a minute. It had been only in 1855, 6 years before the Civil War, when the railroad finally came to Dixon, offering railroad transportation wherever you wanted to go. It was largely, there was some freight, but a lot of transportation, passenger traffic going on the Dixon Railroad. Here's a picture of the railroad bridge in 1855. This thing looks like it's built on toothpicks. I don't know how a train is going to go across this thing and still survive, but as it turned out, just a few years later, they replaced this old bridge, or this rickety bridge, with a more firm one. This is a photo taken in 1862 during the Civil War, because it's right here at Dixon on the railroad tracks, the railroad line from here, where all the soldiers are going to go off to war, and they're going to get on these trains to head out from here. So they had this really nice railroad bridge built in 1862 to be able to accommodate all that. The Illinois Central Railroad was well known and well established at that point. This is a map of the state of Illinois. It went all the way from northern Illinois all the way down to Cairo, Illinois at the very bottom. And so you could go right down into the south, into where the war area was, right from Dixon, Illinois at that time. If you zoom in on this map here, yes, if you look closely, you can see where that blue star is. There's Dixon. There's actually, let me zoom in. There's two Dixons there. There's actually the South Dixon depot and then the North Dixon depot. Did you know we had a North Dixon depot station? I didn't know that, but some of you may have known that. And they didn't tear it down until somewhere in my lifetime. The North Dixon depot station was on the north side of town, of course, but it's, you know, where Murphy's Market used to be. It was right there at the intersection of Brinton and where the railroad tracks were. There was a depot station there as well, and it was there even back in 1855 and in the 1860s as well, the Illinois Central Railroad. It wasn't just the Illinois Central that was here, but there was also another railroad line that came from east to west, the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad. As of 1855, it was later bought out by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, which is now well known as that was the depot station here in Dixon for the Chicago and Northwestern, but it was originally called the Galena and Chicago Union. So from Dixon, you could get soldiers being recruited from the Chicago area coming out here to train, and once they were trained, they could go off to war on the Illinois Central, heading on south through the state of Illinois. This becomes crucially important. I ran across a statement when reading about the Civil War several years ago when it talked about Sherman's march to the sea in 1864. The statement was, every major Civil War battle east of the Mississippi took place within 20 miles of a rail line. The railroad is bringing in all the food, materials, ammunition, weaponry, cannon, whatever people aren't throwing that on their back and carrying it in. The railroads are needed to take all these things off to a battle place someplace. And if you had a training camp like Dixon where you could load people and equipment onto the train, off it would go to the war. Now you see this interesting photo. Notice how the tracks have been bent up. This was from Sherman's march to the sea in 1864. What Sherman did when he did his march to the sea from Atlanta to the Atlantic Ocean, he tore up everything in the path, just laid everything waste from Atlanta on out. And when he came to a railroad, that had to be destroyed because that was crucial to the enemy prosecuting the war, to bring in munitions, to bring in soldiers, to bring in food and equipment, all supplies, everything. So he would take these rails and somehow bend them around a tree. I don't know how, you have to pick a real strong guy to do that. I don't know how they did it, but they called these Sherman's bow ties as they wrapped them around trees back then. But they had to destroy the railroad in order to destroy the Confederate Army. Now, had the Confederates made it this far north, they certainly would have wanted to destroy the railroad depot station here in Dixon, but it never got here, as we all know. So let's talk about some of these regiments that trained in Dixon. And you got to talk about, at first, the Illinois 13th Infantry Regiment. These were called volunteers, and they were indeed volunteers, like my uncle who volunteered for the Illinois 13th right at the beginning. As soon as Fort Sumter was fired upon, he went to the Lee County Courthouse just like everybody else did, and it had many Lee and Whiteside County soldiers. Unlike a lot of regiments in the Army today that will have people from all over the place in the same company or the same regiment, back then, the entire regiment is from this area. Many Lee and Whiteside County soldiers, most of them are from this area back with the Illinois 13th and a lot of the subsequent regiments that came from there. This is a map, of course, of the United States. You can see Dixon up there at the top. As of May 9th, let's go up, May 9th, 1861, that's when they're going to leave Dixon and head south. They got on the train, and down they went, down to Illinois. They hit St. Louis, and they crossed over the Mississippi into Missouri, which was hostile territory at that time. Now, see where that blue dot is here? That's Rolla, Missouri, right there, on July the 6th of 1861, when they arrive there with Colonel John Baker Wyman, who is the colonel of the Illinois 13th. He's the guy in charge of the entire regiment at that time. He was from Amboy, Illinois. He's got quite a story himself. Dave Wyman is here tonight. He's with the vice president with the Lee County Historical Society. Is he definitely related to you? Fifth cousin. 87 times removed. But fifth cousin, spelled the same last name, W-Y-M-A-N, Colonel Wyman. But they stayed there at Rolla, Missouri, and camped there for some time. And he was well liked by the locals, so that they actually named the fort that they built there Fort Wyman. And they've got, if you go down there, you can see this historical marker that explains all about Fort Wyman. The fort is all but gone now today, but it talks all about Colonel John Baker Wyman right down there. He trained at Dixon, Illinois, along with the rest of the Illinois Regiment, and he was from Amboy. But I thought I would point that out. That's where they first went, to Rolla, Missouri, then went on down farther, as that map showed you, to Springfield, Missouri. Now, they're not encountering much opposition throughout Missouri. If they've got any kind of skirmishes at all, they are very minor. No serious fatalities going on. They eventually marched through Arkansas, as that shows you. They hit the Mississippi River, and that's a good thing because now they can get on a boat. They don't have to march anymore because largely they're marching. When the train left them off at St. Louis, they're marching through Missouri, all the way with their knapsack, all their stuff on their back, and marching, off they went. They finally get down on December the 27th of 1862 to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and that is where they have their first major battle. And it's not a good one. It's not the Battle of Vicksburg, but it's one of the precursors to the Battle of Vicksburg. The first one, as a matter of fact, it's called the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, Mississippi, of December of 1862. And as you can tell from the numbers, we did not do so well. There's about a 10-to-1 variance between the casualties for the Union and the casualties for the Confederate. Now, when you see the word casualties, we're not talking about deaths. A casualty is for sure somebody who was killed. He's definitely a casualty. Anybody injured is a casualty. Anybody taken prisoner is a casualty. Anybody getting sick of disease is a casualty. So that's what the word casualty means, and you're going to see the word casualty frequently in this presentation because that's how they looked at that back then. But Colonel John Baker Wyman, that I referred to a little while ago, and that's his photo, he is killed at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, their first major battle in December of 1862. And as I will tell you later, my uncle, Charles Goble, who was just a private, but he also is severely injured at Chickasaw Bayou, and he would die later, but I'll tell you his story later on in the presentation. But let's pick up where the Illinois 13th, they're down there at Vicksburg, Mississippi, and they turn tail and run back up north here. They go back and have a successful battle at a place called Arkansas Post. They do well there. They come back down to Jackson, Mississippi, and they have a battle down there. Then they go back over to Vicksburg in May and July of 1863, which is about 6 months after the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou. Now, Vicksburg is a huge, significant battle. We all know about Gettysburg, which took place at the same time as Vicksburg. But Vicksburg was just as significant, if not more so, than was the Battle of Gettysburg. Vicksburg sits right on the Mississippi River. It's high on a hill, and the Confederates had all their cannons focused on the river. And if you were a Union boat trying to move supplies either up or down river, it wasn't going to happen. They were going to blow you to bits. It was a stronghold for the Confederate Army. And the General Sherman and General Grant knew we've got to take Vicksburg. And so they eventually do the siege of Vicksburg, which you may have heard of. This goes on for 3 months in May, June, and July of 1863. It culminates at the same time that the Battle of Gettysburg culminates on the 4th of July of 1863. And the Union eventually They surrounded the city of Vicksburg, allowed no supplies to get in or out, and people are starving inside. And eventually they say, we give no more, stop. It was a bloody, long, drawn-out battle. Many people lost their lives at Vicksburg. I guess my thing is already advanced. From Vicksburg, the Illinois 13th went north again up to Memphis, and then they started marching. But by that blue line is when they got to take the river to go north. instead of marching all the way. But they get off the boat at Memphis and start marching east. They have a battle at Tuscumbia, Alabama, in October of 1863. They continue on east from there. There's a significant battle at Ringgold, Georgia, in November of 1863. A lot of loss of life there as well. They eventually turn around and come back. Now it's May the 17th of 1864 in Madison, Alabama. And if you notice the timeline here, they started in May of 61. Now it's May of 64. They had signed up for 3 years of duty, and so their time is up. And so it's time for them to go home. And so they do indeed go home. They make their way to the north, going through Tennessee, eventually hitting Cairo, and I think that's where they caught the Illinois Central Railroad, and eventually head on up and all the way back to Dixon, where everybody is mustered out. I think they're either mustered out in Dixon or maybe at some in Springfield, but different places. But they start in Dixon, and basically they end in Dixon, the Illinois 13th. Now, at that time, even though they've served their required 3 years, a lot of them re-sign up again, which often happens in war. I mean, you've been next to these guys every day for 3 years through blood and disease and through thick and thin, and are you going to leave your war buddies? No. A lot of them stayed in and would re-sign up for more duty, because the war is not over yet in May of 64, is it? It's still got a whole other year yet to go before the Civil War would be over. Here's a chronicle of the fatalities of the Illinois 13th. Again, it had 970 men, 10 companies, about 1,000. Of those who were killed or mortally wounded, there was 6 officers only. There was 61 enlisted only. I was kind of surprised the numbers were so low. But the number you want to look at is died by disease, 2 officers, and 123 enlisted. More people dying from disease than from bullets. This was extremely common throughout the Civil War on both sides. Disease was rampant. Some of the distinctions should be noted about the Illinois 13th. They had the claim to fame of being the very first 3-year Illinois regiment. They were the first unit to cross the Mississippi into the hostile regions of Missouri. They were the first at Vicksburg, and they used this as their motto after they reached Vicksburg. This was a point of pride for them. They're fighting at that time under General Sherman at Vicksburg, and this was they used this as their motto. The Illinois 13th, first at Vicksburg, and they used that for the rest of the war. They participated in the siege and the surrender of Vicksburg. They participated in the siege of Jackson, Mississippi, which was successful. Major Bushnell of the 13th Illinois was killed at Ringgold in 1863, one of the key officers. And, of course, Colonel Wyman was killed also at Chickasaw Bayou, as I mentioned earlier. But this statement hit me when I found this in one of the histories. The Illinois 13th measured 1,200 miles with their legs. You know, I've been tracing my steps today. I think I've got 10,000 steps today, but 1,200 miles? Oy, that's a long time, and you're marching with a knapsack on your back and through disease, and sometimes you don't have good shoes, and you got blisters, and oh my, this was what the Civil War was all about. My wife and I had an opportunity to go to Vicksburg last year. I wanted to see the grave of my great uncle who was buried there, and very prominently at Vicksburg. By the way, the entire battleground is huge there, massive. And there's hundreds of monuments at Vicksburg for this company and that regiment and this cavalry, you know, it goes on and on and on, and this battle was here and this skirmish was over here. But the largest by far of all the monuments at Vicksburg, Mississippi, is the Illinois Monument, the largest in the entire battleground. Illinois was really distinguished itself at the Battle of Vicksburg, which is obvious today, and they know it down there at the Vicksburg battleground area. Another distinction of the Illinois Regiment, they fought under General Grant. They also fought under General William Tecumseh Sherman, so that was a point of pride for our local guys as well. They fought against General Joseph E. Johnston. Where was he in 1832? Dixon, Illinois. Isn't that interesting? Johnston, who was here in Dixon in 1832, the Dixon guys end up battling against this guy a number of times in the Civil War later on. So that's the Illinois 13th, but there's more. There's plenty more. Then there's the Illinois 34th Infantry Regiment, which also includes many Lee and Whiteside County soldiers that are training at Dixon. Their distinctions, they were organized by a guy named Edward Kirk of Sterling. I got to tell you about him in here in a minute. He's got an interesting story. The nickname of the 34th was Rock River Rifles, after our river here. Why would they call them the Rock River Rifles? Because this is where they trained in Dixon, Illinois. Companies A and B and some of D, I, and K were all from Whiteside County, as well as many from Lee County at that time. The major battles that the 34th participated in, they're going someplace different than the Illinois 13th. The 34th went to Shiloh. You may have heard of Shiloh. You've probably heard of the Siege of Atlanta, well known by the famous movie Gone with the Wind, Clark Gable, Vivian Leigh. And also the Sherman's March to the Sea. The Illinois 13th is participating in all of that. This was a significant thing for them. They also participate in the surrender of General Johnston's army, the general that was here in 1832, but they were involved in seeing his army surrender in 1865. Let's talk about this guy, General Edward Needles Kirk. This is not a nickname. That's his actual middle name, Needles of Sterling. His history is he's in Ohio, the state of Ohio, as attorney in 1853. In 54, he moves to Sterling. In 1858, he builds the Dillon home. So the Dillon home is not really the Dillon home, it's the Kirk home, because the Dillons bought it later on. But it's this guy who first built that home. And I'm sure that they mention this if you go on the tour through the Dillon home. But Edward Needles Kirk, who was a general with the 34th Illinois. He's wounded at Shiloh. He's the first colonel of the 34th. He's wounded at Shiloh. He's quickly promoted to general after he was wounded. And he is fatally wounded at Stones River, another battle as well. But I thought he just deserves some mention here in this presentation. Since he was from this area as well, he distinguished himself as one of the few generals. By the way, I'll mention this quickly. Whiteside County had 5 who were elevated to general in the Civil War. Lee County didn't have any. So I really don't like mentioning that fact. I've always been battling Sterling all my life, from Dixon, Sterling. But there it is. That's the facts of the matter, so there it is. The Battle of Stones River, which I mentioned, where he was killed. This is look at the casualties here. All told, you got about 25,000 casualties in this battle. 13,000 of them are Union casualties, and one of those is General Edward Needles Kirk. Around the turn of the new year, January of 1863. I saw one page that showed the casualties that the 34th incurred during one battle from March 16th to the 19th. This is a 4-day period in 1865. 10 of this group were killed. 9 of them are missing. They were captured while they're out foraging. 26 of them are injured, and this is some of the injuries that they had. Right arm amputated, wounds to the face, shoulder, neck, knee, mortal head wound, wounds to both arms, one arm amputated, leg amputated. Back then, you get something wounded, they just saw it off and move on. Such was the advancement of medical technology in a war zone in the 1860s. The total number of casualties experienced by the 34th are this. 70 of them were killed in battle. This is 70 out of about 1,000. 70 out of 1,000. 61 died of wounds, but 100 die of disease or accident. So it's not just bullets that are killing these guys. 69 of them go missing, 41 deserted. Imagine, this is not pleasant business, and you're out there in the woods marching along, and if you're really fed up with it, I'm out of here. And away they would go. It was not an honorable thing to do, and still isn't to this day. I'm not encouraging this. But there were 41 that deserted, and 222 were wounded, but not fatally. So that's a little bit. Let's talk about this foraging thing. I ran across some references to the foraging of the 34th Infantry. There was this quote, "There are strict orders for soldiers in the ranks to do no foraging, but there is scarcely a soldier who does not forage from morning till night, for we don't get enough food from our commissary department to keep us from starving." So, again, you're with your company, you're not getting enough food, you're marching out there, your feet hurt, you're starving to death. Are you going to forage? Absolutely. You've got plenty of time during the night. Let's go see if there's a house in the neighborhood. Let's see if they've got a garden out back. We'll raid their tomatoes and whatever else they've got going. Or maybe go right into the house because you're hungry, you got to be fed. And you've seen movies that talk about the soldiers coming into houses and taking everything that they wanted. And this was very common. This is Sergeant William Enderton who's making this statement, and he is in the 34th Regiment of the state of Illinois. Making this statement in 1864. I also ran across this quotation from another soldier from Lee County talking about this problem of food and disease. He said this, "I've got so I can eat meat that's half worms and things that our old dog would not eat." I don't know why I think that he had a southern accent, but it just seems to match. It seems to match with the quotation. But this tells you the daily struggles of people in these regiments out there marching through the woods, no food to eat, and some of the food they are getting, half worms that the dog wouldn't eat. Well, there you go. Today you'll have MREs in the Army, MREs, meals ready to eat that are pretty halfway decent, but none of this stuff going on in the Civil War. So that's the 34th. But there's more. Here's the 46th, and I'll deal with them a little, not quite as long, but that also has many Lee and Whiteside County soldiers. They are also trained at Dixon. They start up in Dixon in 1861, December. Remember, the 13th started off in May of 61. This is about 6 months later, 7 months later. They head down by railroad, go into Tennessee, or Kentucky, and eventually into Tennessee, and they have a big battle at Shiloh starting in February of 1862. The Battle of Shiloh is a key battle of the western region of the war. The Union casualties are 13,000. The Confederate casualties are fewer. Again, at this point in the early part of the war, the Confederate Army is doing better than the Union Army. But both put together, you got still 25,000 casualties as a result of this one battle in Shiloh, southern Tennessee. They continue on from Shiloh. They cross over the state line into Mississippi. They go over to Memphis. They march around in Tennessee for a while and eventually go back down into Mississippi. They catch a boat going down the Mississippi, and they also participate in the siege of Vicksburg in the middle of 1863. So they're meeting up with the Illinois 13th and a whole bunch of other regiments who are participating in this major battle in the summer of 1863. Now, again, this is Vicksburg, Mississippi. It's right on a river. And the battle's going on in June and July of 63. Imagine the heat, the humidity, the mosquitoes, and disease being rampant at that time. And these guys, they're not staying in a hotel at night. They're out there, outside, putting up, and not getting bathed very often. This is what the Civil War was like. So continue on with the 46th Infantry. They then go over to Jackson, Mississippi. They participate in the siege of Jackson. They come back down the Mississippi. They stop at Natchez, Mississippi, go on down further. As farther south as they get is Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and then they eventually turn around and head north again. But here's some of their distinctions with the 46th. At Shiloh, over half of their officers and men were killed or wounded. At Vicksburg, 104 of its soldiers and 7 officers were captured, but 70 of them escape. You know, imagine, let's say they capture 100 soldiers. Well, they don't give them in a fence. They just tell well, we captured you guys, so put down your weapons. Now, none of you guys run off. But some of them decided to run off, and so they did. So 70 escaped. They also participated in the siege of Vicksburg and the siege of Jackson, Mississippi. But on January the 12th of 1864, their tour of duty is up, even though it's not a full 3 years. And they then take the river back on up and then eventually get on a train and head back to Dixon, Illinois, where they are mustered out. That's the 46th Infantry of the Illinois Regiment. Some of the distinctions will center around this guy, Major John Stevens of Dixon. And I bet, Rena, you would recognize this particular photo or this painting. This hangs now proudly at the Lee County Historical Society right down here on Hennepin. It's about this big. It's really well done, of Major John Stevens of Dixon. He originally had come to Dixon in 1846. He was the father of Frank E. Stevens, who became a well-known historian for this area and known for other things as well. But Major John Stevens was an attorney in Dixon. Sometimes these attorneys would immediately become officers in the Civil War right from the get-go. But this guy, before he went off to the war, he was the superintendent of schools in Dixon in 1853 and 1854, such as the school district was at that time. There's like 20 students or something, not that many. But he is killed at the Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee in 1862, and thus he is highly revered by the family back here, and thus you have this really nice portrait of him that hangs at the Historical Society today. Another distinction of the Illinois 46th, they fought against General Albert Sidney Johnston. Where was he in 1832? Dixon, Illinois. But he's now a Confederate general, and the 46th Illinois Regiment is fighting against him. And this guy is also killed at Shiloh in 1862. The Illinois 46th also fought under U.S. General Grant, as did so many other regiments as well, but that is one of their distinctions. But wait, there's more. There's the 75th Illinois Infantry Regiment. They've got 5 Lee County companies and 5 Whiteside County companies. Again, a whole bunch of local people signing up. They are organized at Dixon in September of 62. This is a full year and 4 months after the first Illinois 13th is mustered in and organized at Dixon. So what's going on here is President Lincoln would say, I need, just in rough numbers, I need 10,000 volunteers to sign up by the end of May of 1861. And so then the word would go out, Lee County needs to contribute. Of those 10,000, we got to contribute 256 people. So everybody would know, are you going to join up? We need volunteers, anyone. And they didn't have any problem in Lee County or in Whiteside County having people raise their hand and say, I'll do it, I'm off. They were also fired up about the rebels firing on our Fort Sumter and leaving the United States, so they wanted to go off to war at the same time. So that's how these guys would get. And then later on, President Lincoln, 6 months later, would say, we need another 10,000 from Illinois. And then they'd break that down by county, and we would know what our quota was to reach. And then the word would get passed out, and every mom, dad, and teenage boy would know that they're needed to go off to war. And Dixon always came throughout the Civil War, having meeting the quota for the number of soldiers that needed to go off. The Illinois 75th participates in the Battle of Perryville, Kentucky. Now, you may not have heard of that, and I hadn't heard of that, but there were 47 in the Illinois 75th that were killed during that battle in one day of September of 62. No, not September, it's later on. but there's 166 wounded and 12 missing. I had an interesting discussion with Bill Shaw, who said to me, and I had given a presentation about the Truesdell Bridge, where 46 people from Dixon died on one day with the collapse of the Truesdell Bridge across the Rock River. And I said that this is the worst disaster for Dixon throughout its entire history. And Bill said, but wait. And he was talking about the Battle of Perryville, Kentucky, where 47 were killed. So he's got a point that it exceeds the number of people killed than those in the Truesdell Bridge disaster. However, Bill, the 47 who were killed from the Illinois 75th, there's a lot of them from Whiteside County and a lot of them all over Lee County. They weren't all Dixon people. There's actually very few Dixon soldiers who died at the Battle of Perryville. So the Truesdell Bridge disaster still stands as the worst disaster in Dixon history, so write that down. Other distinctions of the 75th, they participate in Lookout Mountain, you may have heard of. Some of these other battles you may not have heard of. Their totals are 64 of these guys. Of the 1,000 in this regiment are killed, 31 die of wounds, 91 die of disease, and 184 are wounded. But again, disease kills more than bullets. And this is consistent throughout the war, for both sides of the war, for the entirety of the war. There's one guy I want to tell you about, and that's Captain William Parker of Dixon. In 1862, he signs up with the 75th. He's elected a second lieutenant here at Camp Dixon. And in 1864, he is participating in the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in Georgia. All right, nothing unusual so far about that. All right, this captain, he's in a battle. And here's what I read about that. During one of the breaks in the battle, William Parker met with his brother, who was a soldier on the other side. So it's a break in battle. Maybe the two sides are, hey, let's take a break. We're tired. How about you guys? You tired there too? Yeah, let's quit for a while. We'll start back up again around 3 o'clock, okay? They take a break. And then Captain Parker says, hey, my brother's over there. You mind if I come on over there and talk to him for a while? Come on over. We don't care. Yank. And then they go over and they sat down around a campfire, and he and his brother chatted about old times and talked about mom and dad and everything else. And said, well, it's about time to get back to shooting each other. I'll see you later. And then off he went back, and they started shooting each other. I don't think they killed each other or anything like that. But William Parker ended up as the editor and founder of the Rock Falls News, the first newspaper of the city of Rock Falls in 1883. And when he died in 1907, the Sterling Gazette said, quote, Captain Parker should be given the credit of making Rock Falls what it is today. I'm not sure that's a compliment now that I think about it. my apologies to all my friends from Rock Falls, both of you. So that's my story about Cal. I thought it was kind of interesting about him and his brother and the Rock Falls News and all that kind of thing. There's one other regiment I wanted to tell you about, the 8th Illinois Cavalry. They did not train at Dixon. This is a cavalry regiment. They didn't train here, but they had a number of Lee and Whiteside soldiers who were part of the 8th Illinois Cavalry. They had more Whiteside County recruits than Lee County. They drilled in Washington, D.C. in October of 61. They participate in major battles in 1862. Manassas, better known as Bull Run 1, Antietam, Fredericksburg, huge names in Civil War history. The 8th Illinois Cavalry is there. In 1863, they're at Gettysburg. They're also at the Second Battle of Bull Run at Manassas and other battles as well that year. They defend Washington, D.C. in 1864. And in 1865, the 8th Illinois Cavalry goes after John Wilkes Booth after he shoots President Lincoln. So I thought that was it's one of their claims to fame of the 8th Illinois Cavalry. If you go to Gettysburg today, you will see one of the many monuments there. This one is dedicated to the 8th Illinois Cavalry, which had many recruits from Lee and Whiteside County. Now, there are even more than that, but I'm not going to bore you anymore with all these regiments. But here's a list of other regiments from Lee County and Whiteside County also had a bunch as well, but a whole bunch of soldiers. And if you figure there's 1,000 in each one of these regiments, that represents a lot of people from this general area. I'll talk about the total numbers here in a minute from Lee County. I found some statistics about the total number of Illinois recruits for the Civil War. There's 256,000 people who enlisted for the Civil War from Illinois, not just Lee County. So it's 250,000. 20,000 die of disease. 6,000 are KIA. 3,000 die of wounds. 1,000 die in rebel prisons. Ugh. And 205 are lost at sea? I don't know how that happens. But some guys actually ended out there being at sea and get lost at sea. I'm just telling you what the history says. I don't understand it, but that's what it is. But that gives you an idea of the total. There's 250,000 signing up from Illinois. And as we'll see here in a minute, there's 2,400 signing up from Lee County. Now, you might recognize this photo. Where's this photo taken? Lee County Court. You all know that, right? Your divorce papers were filed there, I think. Lee County in the Civil War. If you look, there's that wall there on the right-hand side down on the first floor. That entire plaque lists all the Lee County soldiers who participated, not who died, who participated in the Civil War. And overall, if you look closely, there's 2,400 names there, but records show that there's actually 2,448. I think we need to find those 48 guys who participated who didn't get their names engraved on that plaque. But Lee County decided after they built the Lee County Courthouse in 1900 that they wanted to honor all those guys who went off to war on behalf of the county at that time. George Lamb, some of you remember that name. He was a historian for the Telegraph back in the 60s and 70s. He ran for mayor also at one point in there. He made this statement. He said, on a per capita basis, Lee County sent more manpower to the battlefields of the Civil War than Lee County sent during World War II. That statistic blew my mind as well, because some of you were alive during World War II. My dad was class of 1945, and not all of his classmates graduated with him, because a lot of them signed up when they were juniors and seniors to go off to war for World War II. A lot of people going off to war back then. But there were more per capita going off to war in the Civil War from Lee County than there was from World War II. I thought that was interesting. Now let's have a couple minutes just to talk about my Uncle Charles. This sort of makes it a little more personal. We have a photo of Uncle Charles. Looked like this. Charles J. Goble. He's not a Wadsworth, but he's the son of my great-great-great-grandfather. I'll explain it here in a minute. But that's a photo we have of Charles at that time. He's living in Dixon. He becomes a private in May the 24th of 1861. He enlists with the 13th Illinois Regiment, and he's in Company A of the Illinois Volunteers. He signs up at age 19, along with so many others of his buddies at that time. In 1862, in December 28, at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou that killed Colonel Wyman, he is also severely injured at that time. I was always confused in reading the records, because some of the records say he was killed at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, but we have a letter in our family records from Charles Goble back home to mom and dad and sister, and here's a copy of that thing, and I have this in my records. And I noticed that his letter starts off saying it's from Walnut Hills. And I thought, what's Walnut Hills? Where is this? I know where Walnut is, but Walnut Hills is something else. And then I noticed on a map of Vicksburg, this is a map of Vicksburg, if you look here, Walnut Hills. And I read into the history of Vicksburg, it used to be called Walnut Hills. So he's writing from Vicksburg on July the 9th. Let me back up to his letter here. You see up here on the right, July 9th of 1863, which is an interesting date because it's July 4th of 1863 when the Union win the Battle of Vicksburg and the hostilities there end. But he is in a hospital probably at Walnut Hills at Vicksburg on July the 9th. But let's go back to this letter, and back up here in this, if you look closely up here, which you can't see it here, but it says Chickasaw Bayou. Chickasaw Bayou is up there in the north part of Vicksburg, and that's where that battle takes place that takes out Colonel Wyman, is also where my Uncle Charles is also severely injured. Looking at the letter, I highlight some of this. He says to Mom and Dad, he says, since I left the hospital, my wound has troubled me a great deal, caused by the exposure I was obliged to endure. He says, I took charge of an ambulance, and I got along pretty well until the 5th of July when we were ordered off on a march, and the first day's driving used me up completely, and I was left behind. He continues on saying, in about 2 months, I will be willing to take the ambulance again, but I can never carry a knapsack again. We still to this day do not know the nature of his injuries, but he couldn't carry a knapsack again. When I saw this reference in his letter to an ambulance, of course, when we think of an ambulance, we think of, we got the lights flashing and then a car speeding down the road. Well, what's an ambulance in the Civil War? Well, I found one online, and it's a wagon. Let's throw the bodies in the back. They'll be okay. Let's get them off to the hospital tent. And that's what the Civil War ambulance had to have somebody drive this thing. And Uncle Charles, Private Charles, was able to whip the reins to get the horses to go and pull the ambulance to wherever it needed to go. And what was a knapsack like? Well, I was able to find some photos, actual photos of a Civil War knapsack. And so whatever his injury was, he would not have been able to carry that on his back. I assume maybe he shot through the shoulder or something, but it limited his ability to do that. And then the most maybe heartwarming or heart-touching part of his letter home, he starts a new page, and it says here, and now my little sister. And I sometimes get choked up reading about this, because this is a photo of his little sister, Josephine Goble, who later married John Washington Wadsworth, my great-great-grandfather. But Jophie looked something like this. He called her Jophie. That was his nickname for little sister Josephine. And he says, now, my dear little sister. He says, in writing to her, the most thing I regret about losing my knapsack is that it contained the last letter that you wrote me, Jophie, and it was so neatly written and correctly spelled that I prized it very highly. Imagine that. Here's your big brother who's now 20, 21 years old, off to war, and she's writing letters to Big Brother, and he's prizing her letters to him, and he's telling her, praising her for how neat writing she had and what correct spelling. He says in his letter to Jophie, the last few days there have been rumors afloat that Lee's army has been badly whipped, because they'd heard about Gettysburg by now, as well as Vicksburg. And if that is the case, we may not have to serve the remainder of our time. But the next sentence from his pen is this one, but I am afraid that it is too good to be true. And he was right. It was too good to be true. And sadly, about 6 weeks later, Uncle Charles dies in Vicksburg. And when my wife and I went down there last year, we found his gravestone in this massive Vicksburg cemetery at the Vicksburg National Cemetery. There says C.J. Goble right there. I tell you, there's just a sea of gravestones throughout the Vicksburg National Cemetery there. And this is a photo of my Uncle Charles. Died at age 21, 22 there. Born in 1841, died in 1863. But his story is just like, you may have relatives as well who died in that thing, but their story had to be very similar to that. Another angle I want to put on this, just briefly, is the involvement of local women in the Civil War. Of course, they didn't go off to war. No women went off to war back in the 1860s. It just wasn't done. They may have been nurses, for sure. This is a photo, by the way, of my great-great-great-grandmother, who is the mother of Charles Goble, and daughter Jophie there. I'd show you this photo just to show how women would have dressed and what they would have looked like back in the 1860s. But in the 1914 Lee County history, there's a section in there written by Mrs. S.S. Dodge, who I think is the daughter-in-law to Mrs. O.B. Dodge of the O.B. Dodge Library right here. This is right next to the O.B. Dodge Library. But Mrs. S.S. Dodge wrote this section about the women. She says, and the women, what did they do in the war? Do what didn't they do? Who can measure the silent agony that the women endured in the Civil War? She says, wives were left to be father and mother to the children, and often the breadwinner too, because dad is off to war. Mothers saw the school book drop from the son's hand or the hoe drop in the field, and they never said a word to keep them back from going off to war. She says also, in my own family, a dear young uncle of barely 21 was married the morning he left for the war. He was sent home soon with illness, spent a short 3 weeks with his bride, then he went back to war again to die shortly later, a victim of poor food and insanitary surroundings. Such is the reality of the Civil War for people in this area. Now, another cool angle to this whole thing about the Civil War is the Civil War reunions of the regiments. If you read the Telegraph back in the late 1800s, the Civil War veterans are getting together for regiment reunions on a regular basis, and here's a photo, by the way, of one of the infantry, of the 13th Illinois Infantry reunion. And what's that building there? That's the Nachusa House, of course, and they're all lined up. They're dressed nicely for their big photo. They were very, very proud of having participated in the Civil War. They were very, very glad to see their former soldier buddies. This is another photo of the Nachusa House back around the turn of the century, and this is a more modern photo of what it looks like to this day. But to go back to that 1883 regiment reunion in that year, the newspaper would often cover these regimental reunions and what took place. And in this particular newspaper article in 1883, they mentioned the toasts that they did. One of the first toasts that the regiment did, somebody would raise a glass and say, "To the Illinois 13th Regiment, hear, hear," and they'd all raise their glass and take a drink. One of the second toasts was, "To the Stars and Stripes, hear, hear," and they'd all raise a glass and take another drink. Then I like this one, "To the Pay Department," and they raised a glass and took another drink. And you imagine being out there, they're just glad to get paid for some kind of remuneration for all the grief that they had endured. They thanking the pay department. But the toast that really caught my attention was this one. You think of all these young soldiers, 20 years old, hormones raging. They then toast, "To the ladies of America." They raise their glasses and take another drink. So this is what something of what the regimental reunions must have been like. So one more story and then I'm done. This is brief. I want to talk about Dixon's peace cannon. You may not have heard about this, but as it turns out, my Uncle Charles, when he lived in Dixon in the 1850s, he wrote a daily diary, which our family still has, and I can read what he said in any given day. Well, on July 3rd of 1856, this is 5 years before the war, he says, "The citizens of Dixon have purchased a cannon for the 4th of July. Oh boy, look out. The people have got themselves a cannon. And then he mentions that the cannon was fired several times last night on the 4th of July. Of course, we just had to shoot off this cannon. Also, the peace cannon would be not only shot on the 4th of July. When Lincoln came to town in 1856 to stump for John C. Fremont, the first Republican candidate for president, the cannon is again fired, notifying the city that Abe Lincoln is in town. He's not a president at that time at all, but it was a big deal. And then at the start of the Civil War, they fired off the peace cannon again. And then at the end of the Civil War, they fired off the peace cannon again. I am told one of the stories that talks about the peace cannon, I assume they're blasting it off from the courthouse lawn. This thing would make a huge noise, and with one blast, the windows of the Baptist church across the street shattered. So, enough of you guys and your stupid cannon, stop that. So I think they must have used too much gunpowder or something that year. But the peace cannon ends up being lost. And in 1965 is this article in the Telegraph. I vaguely remember this from my youth. The peace cannon was unearthed in John Dixon Park. You remember Mayor Jim Burke? Mayor Jim Burke was involved in this along with, was it George Lamb or somebody else? But they get out there and they actually have a metal detector. They have an idea that the cannon has been buried somewhere in John Dixon Park. They had an idea where it was. It was in the southwest corner of John Dixon Park. And they're out there with I think I got that right, southwest? I don't know. But they've got a detector, and they think they've got something, and they dig down, I don't know, 6 feet, and boom, there's the cannon, and there's a picture of it up there right here. Notice it's blunted, it's not very big, but they ended up rebuilding the thing, and they restored it, and it now lays literally on the courthouse lawn up at the Lee County Courthouse. It's Dixon's peace cannon. It's got a plaque on it that says it's the cannon that was never fired in anger. So that's, if you want to walk up the courthouse lawn, you can look at Dixon's peace cannon, one of the remnants from the Civil War, never fired in anger at anybody, but it's one of Dixon's claim to fame throughout the Civil War. And that, my friend, is my best shot at Dixon's remarkable role in the Civil War. Thanks for listening for a long presentation. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that. Now, you have questions or anything? We can deal with that. Somebody, if you've got anything at all.
Were the Dement barracks Leonard Anderson's plow factory? You said it was in an old plow factory.
Yes, it must have been a plow factory. The Grand Detour Plow Factory.
Was Leonard Anderson?
You know, John Deere, he started that in Grand Detour, but later on, he left early on, 1848. You worked there all the time. 1848, he goes to Moline and he leaves Major Andrus in charge, right? And eventually they move to Dixon and they take over or they build a factory, I assume, but by 1861, the Dixon barracks was a part of the plow factory. Oh, there you go. All this becomes to come together. Isn't that kind of cool? All this works together. There's a question back here. Go ahead. Hey, how many of you know that you had a relative participate in the Civil War? Somebody asked me that. Oh, my word. There's maybe 20 of you. Wow. How many of you had a relative that died in the Civil War? Okay, about 5 or 6 of you. Very interesting. So these are very, very sad events in a family history, and they tend to reverberate from generation to generation, because it's when you get the news that son who is off to war is not coming back. Like my Uncle Charles, they didn't bring his body back. He just buried in Vicksburg and never made it back home again. Some bodies did come back, especially if they were officers, but often they did not. And Colonel Wyman was buried. He got brought back, right?
He was originally.
You have this?
Originally, according to what
Let me try this.
I've read.
Test one. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. According to what I've read, he was returned and buried in Prairie Repose in Amboy.
Prairie Repose Cemetery.
Yep. And then from an article that I read in the Telegraph, one night under darkness, his widow, who had remarried, got an offer from Rose Hill Cemetery in Chicago, which is where he is buried now, because it was just being formed, and they were looking for some names to bury there. And they offered her apparently money. And so in the dark of night, they came out to disinter him under the cover of darkness and apparently were caught. But eventually, she legally got him, and he was removed and moved to Chicago, which is where he is now.
Well, I think we should get him back, don't you think? Who's with me?
You'd have a tough time. His men coughed up just over $1,000 to build a monument for him. It's about 4 feet on a side, wow, and it's about 13 feet tall. And I'll just say, Prairie Repose also, when you walk in, has a huge area devoted strictly to Civil War burials. It's very nice.
Very cool.
But thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah. Very interesting stuff. Any other questions, comments? Yes, right here.
Speaking of the horrific amount of casualties and stuff like that, who came in and how did they take care of all these bodies and know that they had the right ones when they buried them in those kind of cemeteries?
That's not an area that I've investigated a whole lot, but on the battlefields of Gettysburg or wherever, there's bodies everywhere, and you sometimes see these grotesque photos of these bloated bodies out there. They would just lay out there for days, but everybody knew they had to get buried. You can't leave them out there, and so they would go out there and bury them right where they are. And anytime you see these battleground areas, there's a huge cemetery nearby. But who did that? Maybe it was the locals, maybe it was the soldiers, I don't know.
That's your next speech.
That's my next. I'll tell you where all the bodies are buried next time. Dave.
Yeah, the question that I have is, what is the population of Lee County when you consider how many served from Lee County? What was the population that they were pulling from?
Yeah, okay. So they got 2,400 soldiers. 1860, I think I know this information is in my head. Ray Traping. Dixon's population during the Truesdale Bridge collapse in 1873 was 8,000. Is that right? So that's about 10 years afterward. That's just Dixon. So maybe there's 10,000 people living in Lee County. And let's just say that's right. Nobody's going to dispute me here. There's 10,000 people. I counted them myself. So the 10,000, and of those 2,400, oh my word, that's a pretty high percentage. Yeah, and they're focusing on men, obviously, not women. Ages, basically, 20 to 25, and sometimes outside of that range. And there's not that many who are that age.
Was Lee County, by that time, was they separated from Goble?
Yes, that happened in 1839. Yeah, 1839 is when Lee and Goble separated. So that's still 25 years later. So it's still per capita, as George Lamb's statement, per capita, there's a lot of people going off to war. Other questions?
You were saying somewhere from Whiteside County, too, so it wasn't just Dixon.
Well, the 2,400 is Lee County. And the Whiteside County numbers, they have those numbers as well. And I'm sorry to admit, it's just slightly more than 2,400. Dang, they beat us again. Jeff?
Wikipedia says the population of Lee County in 1860 was 17,651.
17,000. So if there's 2,400 out of 17,000, doing the math there, it's 15%. You doing the math for me? So 17,000, 2,400 out of 17,000. 14 to 15%. How about that? Okay. Listen, I've gone on a long time here. I thought I'd be done by 8. It's after that. There are refreshments in the parlor. Off to that, we just start walking that way. You'll get there. If you have more questions, feel free to come up. I'd love to talk to you. But thanks again for coming. Appreciate it.